One of the keys to a successful NHL regular season is a team continuing to tinker, improve, and find ways to get better on the margins. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday afternoon edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, where you can enjoy the NFL playoffs with a big return. New customers can place a $5 bet and get started with $200 in bonus bets. Win or lose your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So on today's show, the odyssey that is Kasperi Kapanen's NHL career, the new look third line we saw at practice yesterday, and what type of challenge the Boston Bruins present in tonight's contest. So anytime you claim a player off of waivers, you are more likely than not looking for a stopgap, a Band-Aid, something to fill in an immediate need. And players get placed on waivers for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there's front office turnover, coaching staff turnover, and what an organization had seen previously in a player is no longer applicable. You know, the people in charge in St. Louis had an idea when they originally claimed Kapanen off of waivers from the Penguins, and then things changed. You know, you fired Craig Berube, you fired Drew Bannister. Drew Bannister got fired, I believe, after Kapanen got claimed off of waivers by the Oilers, but something changed there for Kapanen. And at the time when the Oilers made the waiver claim, they had a pressing need for anybody with a pulse. If you'll recall, talking about injuries to Zach Hyman, to Victor Arvidsson, and at various points, they've just lacked enough bodies. And thankfully, that's turned around. You know, Hyman returned after about 2.5 weeks to the lineup. Arvidsson, quite a bit longer than that. That was like 6 weeks where Arvidsson was out with a lower body injury. But now, sitting here, putting Kapanen's career trajectory into its proper context, this is the type of guy, in terms of his career trajectory, that it says a lot about your organization's willingness to be adaptable and to give opportunities, that Kapanen's kind of played his way into staying in the lineup. You know, Corey Perry's only been healthy scratched once so far this season. Derek Ryan only a handful of times as well. Jeff Skinner a handful of times. But very clearly, both the coaching staff and the guys that Kapanen plays with, they see a value in having his toolbox. And if you go back and watch the episode I did the day they claimed him, Kapanen is a former first-round pick from almost 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago at this point, because he's 28 years old now. But it's been a long, winding road for Kasperi Kapanen. And when you're a former first-round pick of a good organization like the Penguins, you are always going to get opportunities, and teams are always going to take shots on people with traits, and traits are not always going to translate to statistics and the NHL level, because Kapanen is an above average skater when he's at full speed. I think he's 92nd percentile for top skater speed, but he's below 50th percentile in speed bursts over 20 miles per hour. So high-end speed, but doesn't use it a whole lot. So you have a strong skater at high-end speeds. But how often during an NHL game does a player really skate at full speed? That's a fair question. You know, it's kind of the conversation we have a lot of the time in football, where we're talking about arm talent, how far can he throw? Well, how often is a quarterback really throwing the ball 50 or 60 yards in the air? Once a game? Twice a game? If that? So how much do we want to put into top speed? And then he's got an above average shot. He's in the upper quartile. I believe he's 80 something percentile in shot speed, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 89th percentile in top shot speed. And when you see high-end skate speed and high-end shot speed, a lot of people would look at the career that Kapanen's had and say, that's disappointing. He should have been better, because those two traits, the top end skate speed and the top end shoot speed, those are traits that will get you indefinite opportunities. If you can continually show that you skate very fast and you shoot very fast, teams are going to be willing to give you chances. And you think about how Kapanen's career has developed, where originally drafted by the Penguins, traded to the Maple Leafs for Phil Kessel, traded back to Pittsburgh, given a long-term extension, put on waivers, claimed by the Blues, plays in St. Louis for a year and a half, gets put on waivers again, and the Oilers claim him. And do I think some of that was just Stan Bowman wanting to spite the Blues for submitting offer sheets to Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway? Sure. But lo and behold, Kasperi Kapanen's played well enough that the Oilers feel they need to keep him in the lineup. That is a positive and an optimistic development. And the Oilers were lacking foot speed. I made that point quite a bit during the first 6 to 8 weeks of the season, that you lose Ryan McLeod and Dylan Holloway and Warren Fogel's straight line skate speed, and you didn't really replace it. Jeff Skinner is a reasonably fast straight line winger, but he doesn't really use it in the way those other guys did in terms of carrying the puck into the offensive zone or going to get loose pucks on a dump and chase. And I think from the Kapanen perspective, getting an opportunity to play consistently on a really good team can be invigorating and really open some doors for you professionally, because I don't think the Oilers are particularly married to the idea of Kapanen coming back next year. They very easily could end up waiving him once Evander Kane is eligible to return from LTIR and he's up to game speed. But if you're another team looking at this and you say, well, he's a former first-round pick, the Oilers, who fancy themselves Stanley Cup contenders, they played this guy 40 games, 50 games. If he's good enough for the Oilers, he's probably good enough for us. And guys like this, who have had bumpy roads, where they've been with quite a few organizations, they don't have the most stable footing, they don't have the most durable or elastic contract to protect them. These guys are very grateful when they get opportunities. And for someone like Kapanen, to ride shotgun with Draisaitl for 15, 20 games in December of 2024, that might be the difference between staying in the NHL or being in the AHL next year. And I'm very happy that this has worked out for him, because A, the Oilers needed him, and B, he just gives the Oilers another type of player. They need that raw foot speed. When you have him, you have Janmark, you have Connor Brown to augment what you get from McDavid. It really helps when you have speed throughout your lineup. And speaking of throughout your lineup, we're going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we come back, we're going to tackle the new look third line, the theory behind it, and a whole lot more. Be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are better with FanDuel. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. It's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. If you're looking over at the slate, it's wild card weekend. To open the festivities Saturday afternoon, Justin Herbert and the Chargers heading to Houston to take on the Texans, where the Chargers are 2.5-point road favorites. The Saturday night game, old school AFC North, Steelers at the Ravens 9.5-point favorites. The best game of the weekend, though, probably the Packers heading to Philadelphia, where the Eagles are 4.5-point favorites. We'll see how healthy Jordan Love is after the injury scare in Week 17. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are talking all things the lineup. And I love these types of conversations because it lets me understand how people think about things. And there's two layers to that because number one, sometimes someone will just come out and tell you what they're thinking. They'll say, well, we want to put this player with this player because we think X brings Y to line B. And other times, when it's a little more indirect, when you have to infer a bit and you have to try and guess, that is where it becomes a fun exercise in both creativity and perspective. And one of the things I really enjoy talking about sports in the abstract is understanding perspective and point of view because people watch sports differently. And you can be a very knowledgeable fan but not totally know everything. And that's how I've always approached the sports media work I do. I come to this like, for lack of a better expression, the scientist doing the scientific method. I have a theory, I conduct an experiment, and based on the results of said experiment, I can draw a conclusion and then decide, do I need to do more research or do I have an answer? And I think coming at questions with curiosity is very, very constructive because it forces you to consider other perspectives. And when we're talking about lineup decisions, we can look at them in the abstract of, well, what does this do directly? What does this do indirectly? And then what does this say about the team? And the new look third line that was at practice on Monday is a good indication of that. Seeing Jeff Skinner on the wing with Adam Henrique and Zach Hyman on the third line on the right wing, I think that's a very interesting combination for a few different reasons. Number one, we talked about Adam Henrique last week on the show, and I personally feel that if you look at the shot metrics, as we talked about, if you look at his numbers with Connor Brown and Matthias Janmark, they were fine. Henrique's numbers, his underlying numbers on the whole for the season, are not great. He's 42% of shot share, like 40-something% of expected goals. The numbers are not great. But with Janmark and with Connor Brown, those underlying numbers as a combination, those three as a line, they are more than adequate. The problem, of course, they're not scoring enough. So how does a coach try and get a guy going if he can't score? Well, you put the best or second best pure goal scorer on the team on his line in Zach Hyman. And the idea for this, in my opinion, is that Chris Knobloch says, I want to see if we can get something out of Adam Henrique. If I put a real play driver in Zach Hyman down here and Henrique still can't get going, then I think we have a conversation about moving Adam Henrique to the wing like we saw in spurts in the playoffs last year where he played on McDavid's wing with Hyman. But we want to give him a bona fide goal scorer to play with to be sure. Because as we said on that episode, that entire Adam Henrique deep dive, he hasn't had the best finishing luck. His line mates haven't had the best finishing luck. And he shot out of his mind in his limited run as an Oiler last year, both in the regular season and the playoffs, over 17% in the regular season, I believe over 15% in the postseason. And those numbers are really not sustainable because that infrequency of shooting and then still converting at a high rate, that's not how sports work, where the hot hand prevails in a small sample. It's why playoff hockey is so inherently unpredictable, because it's such a short window of games where when we typically talk about stats, save percentage, shooting percentage, we're talking about 82 games by the end of the regular season. And when we get to a playoff series, we're talking about seven out of 82 is less than 10% of the regular season sample size. So that's something to keep in mind there. But in the abstract, you are saying, let's see if we can squeeze anything out of Adam Henrique. I don't imagine Zach Hyman staying on the third line long term. I think this is can we find something here in the interim to get Henrique going? And then we go back to what we've been doing. And one of the perks of having Leon, having Connor, is the fact that you can ask them for a few games to play with more one-dimensional players. You can play Connor Brown with McDavid for 2 or 3 games, and it won't really be an issue. McDavid is good enough that he can carry him to passable underlying numbers, and the Oilers will control play in their minutes together, and it's not a tall ask. Now, you're not going to do that for an entire season. You know, you don't want to revisit some of the Peter Chiarelli iterations of the Oilers where you're playing guys like Zach Kassian with Connor McDavid. You don't want to do that. But at the very least, you do want to have options, and trying to squeeze as much out of your lineup as you can before the deadline to get as much actionable information as you can. That's very helpful as both a coach and a front office. It's why I'm always in favor of experimentation when it comes to lineup decisions, because if something works, you know, something innate works, there's going to be, if something works, it's going to end up being sustainable long term. And if it doesn't work, then you have a knowledge that it doesn't work. All of that, tie it together. So you have your 82 game regular season, and I, for one, love using the regular season as a trial and error of finding out what works. Okay, if this works, why don't we try this? And why don't we try this? And we talked about that a little bit the other day on Locked On Oilers, the idea that Chris Knobloch is juggling the lineup a lot to try and keep things fresh, to keep trying to see a different perspective on things. And at a certain point, the players might begin to get a little agitated by constantly a lack of chemistry. But at the same time, this is a very interestingly constructed roster. There are a lot of options, but I, for one, don't really have a good feel on how it's all going to come together, if that makes sense. You know, I think we're going to end up with Zach Hyman, with Nuge, with McDavid. I think we're going to end up with Draisaitl, with Podkolzin, and with Arvidsson. I think we're going to end up with Jeff Skinner, with Adam Henrique, with Connor Brown. I think we're going to end up with Janmark, Kasperi Kapanen, and Derek Ryan. And at some point, Evander Kane will throw his hat into the ring as far as an opportunity to play, because I don't think the Oilers would be able to move on from him without his permission. And if I were Evander Kane, why would I want to leave a team that has a chance to be a Stanley Cup contender, where I could play at the very least third line minutes on a good team and try and parlay myself into at least a more desirable situation in the summer, when more teams would be available for a trade, because his no trade clause expires after the deadline this year. We're going to take one more break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, and when we come back, we're going to tackle what the Bruins present as far as matchups and a whole lot more on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. In 2025, it's very easy to lose track of subscriptions. That's definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together all in one place, whether it's subscriptions, spending habits, or the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. For me, the best feature is the savings goal. I've been able to automatically set aside money for my future with no more stressing about budgeting every month. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/locked-on today. That's rocketmoney.com/locked-on. Remember, use that code so they know we sent you. rocketmoney.com/locked-on. Thank you to everyone who was hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. And I watched the Bruins very intently last Thursday when they were playing the Rangers. And it's very weird to see a Bruins team that is this fangless. You know, it would be like seeing a dog with no teeth if I were looking for a comparison. For much of my conscious memory, you know, I'm 27, I'll be 28 years old next month. For much of my conscious memory, the Bruins have always been miserable to play against. When you go back to those early 2010 teams, when you talk about guys like Danny Paille and Lucic, Young Marchand, Chara, Adam McQuaid, Andrew Ference. Those teams, they were miserable to play against. And then they've had some different permutations over the years. They've definitely had an influx of high-end talent midway through last decade, when you can drop in a Charlie McAvoy, a David Pasternak, and of course, the sublime excellence of Bergeron. Krejci's very understated, but very, very consistent Krejci, who was always better in the playoffs than in the regular season, frankly. And they are entering the final chapter of that book. That Marchand is basically the last guy who has real direct ties to that excellence. And look, Pasta, McAvoy, Swayman, those are all great players. Pasta, McAvoy, and Swayman are all top 30 players in the NHL. I have no hesitation in saying Pasta's top 20. McAvoy is definitely top 20. And Swayman, I think, is one of the better goalies in the NHL. But once you get past their big three, the fall off in their lineup is remarkable. And it is the aftermath of an 8-year period where every single year they tried to get better in the offseason, at the trade deadline. And when you are constantly burning draft picks, as we all know, if you are burning draft picks, you are not restocking the cupboard with young, cheap talent. When you can't graduate your prospect from the AHL to the NHL, you have to go out and spend more money. It's why you have to go out and buy Elias Lindholm. You have to go out and buy Nikita Zadorov. It's why you trade for Hampus Lindholm and give him a big extension within a week of acquiring him, because the Bruins were trying to sustain where they were at. And it's a very direct comparison to the credit crisis in the Western world that's going on right now, where credit card debt has never been higher because the cost of living has continued to rise and wages have stagnated. So to justify staying where people are in terms of what they expect out of their living experience, when it comes to vacations, consumer goods, they buy more things on credit than they ever have before. And because of that, there is a credit crisis where people are defaulting at higher rates than ever. And it's the same thing in professional sports. Eventually, trying to maintain a standard of living on credit will bite you in the butt. And the Bruins, more likely than not, are going to make the playoffs this year. They benefit from playing in the Atlantic, and the East at large, and the Metro is worse than the Atlantic because, look, I think the Hurricanes and Devils are both pretty good. I don't think either of those teams is beating Florida. I can make an argument that maybe Tampa Bay could beat one of, if not both of those teams. The Leafs, until the Leafs win 2 playoff series in a year, I'm not going to take them particularly seriously, even if it is a Mitch Marner, John Tavares last dance year. But as far as the Bruins as a matchup, they don't really have the same old oof to their game. They don't really have that control factor that they used to. They couldn't beat the Rangers for more than 1 goal last Thursday. And I don't know if you guys know this as the listeners and watchers of Locked On Oilers, but the Rangers defense is very, 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 very bad. And because of that, teams typically score a lot of goals against them. But the Bruins, they couldn't get to their game. They couldn't get Pasta and Marchand going. They don't really have a lot of depth, in all honesty. If you go look at the Bruins and their stat leaders, it's pretty dire once you get past their big guns. Pasta has 42 points. Marchand has 32 points. They've played 42 games. After Marchand's 32 points, the next leading scorer on the team is Pavel Zacha with 21. Then it's Elias Lindholm with 20. Then it's Charlie McAvoy with 19. The Bruins' 5th highest point leader this season has 19 points in 42 games. The Bruins are scoring 2.64 goals per game. They have scored 111 goals in 42 games. They have conceded 3.12 goals against per game. They have conceded 131 goals in 42 games. The Bruins are really struggling offensively, and it has put an outsized burden on their defense. And on paper, the Bruins defense isn't bad. I think Charlie McAvoy is probably the most well-rounded of the young defensemen of him, Adam Fox, Quinn Hughes, Cale Makar. I think McAvoy absolutely is the best defensively out of the three, and his offensive instincts are more than adequate. If he ever was on a great power play that the Bruins just don't have anymore, he easily could be in the ballpark for a 70-point season as a defenseman. But you've got McAvoy, you've got Zadorov, who in spurts is very good, but is also mind-bogglingly inconsistent. You still have Hampus Lindholm. You have Brandon Carlo. That's a pretty solid 1 through 4 that most teams would be happy with. But when you are consistently struggling to score and the margin of error for your team is 1 goal, it puts a lot on your goalie, on your defense. And Jeremy Swayman, not having a preseason, not having a training camp, did not get off to the most audacious of starts. And he's been playing better as of late, but he still has an .891 save percentage and a goals against average of almost 3. He is not playing at a particularly high level right now. And for the Bruins, as they're currently constructed, the Bruins are going to need to win games 2-1, 3-2 on goaltending and defense. And they need to score the 2 or 3 goals. That's kind of the issue for them. We talked about it a lot in respect to the Oilers the first month of the season, that yes, the defense isn't playing well. The penalty kill was abhorrent. But if we're only scoring 2 goals a game, it's hard for me to be particularly mad at the goaltending or the defense, because the expectation is that this forward group is going to carry the load. But for the Bruins, they need to lock these games down. And they need Pasta or Marchand to play hero ball, basically. There isn't really a path to the Bruins playing at a particularly high level, and it's really going to be difficult for them to consistently win hockey games the way they're constructed and their preferred style of play. But that'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. We will have an episode for you tonight after the game against the Bruins. That'll be nice to get out of the way, talk, and thankfully for me, the Oilers are in the Eastern time zone, so it'll be a lot easier to get that episode in without being a little cross-eyed by the end. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell. We're inching there, 1 sub at a time. We will be at 2,000 subscribers by the NHL playoffs. That's the goal. I will talk to you guys after the game against the Bruins. Let's go Oilers.